We're going to be talking today about harm reduction and our perspective that harm reduction is love. And our agenda today, it looks like this. We're going to do a quick land acknowledgement, a quick welcome and introductions, and I really appreciate, Aline, that you've already done most of the introductions. We're going to just talk a little about housekeeping stuff, and then we're going to jump into it. We're going to define harm reduction so that we all know what it is we're talking about, what the principles are of harm reduction. I'm going to go into a little bit of history. Tina knows it's my favorite thing, so I'm really going to try not to talk too much, but I do think it's important to know how we got here to ground our conversation. So we are going to talk a little bit about history. We're going to talk about what harm reduction looks like in practice. We're going to talk about the future of harm reduction as well. We have on here that the discussion and questions is at the end, but I really do encourage everyone to ask questions as they come up. Aline is going to help us out if you raise your hand or just unmute yourself. We're happy to cover quick questions, just clarifying question as we go, and then we'll have a larger conversation at the end. We do want to do a land acknowledgement, and Tina, I'm going to turn it over to you to do that.
Thank you, Barb. Okay, so this is the land acknowledgement that we use at the City of Toronto, but I'm mindful that people are calling in from all over the province, so I'll leave it to each of you to acknowledge the land you live and work on. I am in Toronto and acknowledge with gratitude all those who were stewards of this land before my family came here. I also acknowledge the disproportionate effect that our drug laws have had on Indigenous people on Turtle Island, as well as those descendants of people brought here forcibly through the transatlantic slave trade.
Thanks, Tina. Okay, so some housekeeping things. So as we said, jump in with any questions or comments. We encourage you to participate or share, contribute as much as you are comfortable. And if you're most comfortable with your camera off and just listening, that's participating too. We expect that any personal information that's shared here will be respected as confidential. Often when we're talking about drug use, there's lots of stigma and sometimes shame involved. And we appreciate anyone who's willing and able to share personal stories and expect that everyone will just keep that confidential. So we have already introduced ourselves, hoping to get an idea of what folks are hoping to get out of today's workshop. And I'm wondering if you can just put some things in the chat and Aline can help us out by reading them out. And while you're doing that, I'll just note that most of the photographs in our workshop are our own. So just acknowledging Tina and other folks on the team that have taken pictures of our staff. These are two of the staff from our overdose prevention site located at 260 Augusta Avenue in Kensington Market. And we were doing an education fair, joining in with other folks and set up this table to let people know what we do at KMOPS. Okay, is there anything in the chat about what people are hoping to get out of today's workshop?
Not so far.
Okay. Is the agenda that we have shared, does that look okay to people? Maybe some thumbs up.
Yes. Oh, there is something in the chat. I want to learn, what can we do to stop the Ford's agenda of violence and harm? I think we all want to know that. So
yeah, I'd like to know that too. I'm hoping
that's a good one
from you guys. Okay, so we're going to move right along then. So I'm just wanting people to reflect on what they think about when they hear the term harm reduction. When we do interviews for staff, potential staff coming into our department at TNG, we often ask them what they think about when they hear the term harm reduction. And if they're fairly new to the field, we often hear things about, you know, it's the kits that you hand out. Some people have a very broad understanding of harm reduction to encompass anything that reduces harm in the world. I think that's fine. We want to reduce harm in the world. I think for us at TNG, we're wanting to maintain the term harm reduction as something that is about and for people who use drugs. Because once we start opening it up to, you know, harm reduction is wearing seatbelts, harm reduction is brushing your teeth so you don't get gum disease. Those things are all good things. But we find that then if it becomes that broad, we start to lose the people who are most marginalized, start to lose out. And the funding starts going towards, you know, seatbelt wearing promotion programs, or, you know, they go to dentists to encourage people to brush their teeth. And the money and the attention and the focus gets turned away from people who use drugs. And that's really what harm reduction is about. It was born from people who use drugs by that community of people. And so when we are talking about harm reduction, that's what we're talking about. And I see some things coming up in the chat, but I can't see what they are.
Okay, just sort of. Oh yes, some other people have mentioned keeping people safe and alive. And somebody said, I know how to administer Narcan. I wonder what else I should be aware of to identify and help people who may be in danger.
That's fantastic. And I'm hoping that by the end of this workshop, you will have some more ideas about exactly that. So this is just a few photos. I like pictures. So harm reduction is drug checking. That's our poster in the middle. We do anonymous drug checking at KMOPS, which stands for the Kensington Market Overdose Prevention Service. So people knowing what's in their drugs is important. Naloxone, somebody mentioned they know how to administer Narcan. That's fantastic. The photograph on the bottom left is not mine. It's a protest and a memorial at Oppenheimer Park in Vancouver. Crosses for all the folks that they had lost to overdose in that community. The upper right is the first overdose prevention site in Ontario. It was in a tent that the folks from the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society, TOPS, in partnership with THRAW, which is the Toronto Harm Reduction Alliance, just put up a tent, and they started encouraging people to come if they're using, to use in the tent. And if they overdosed, then their overdose was reversed. So some of our colleagues there at the tent in Moss Park, and then just some sterile and unused drug using supplies. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Tina to talk about a more formal definition of harm reduction to help guide our conversation.
Okay, so the definition of harm reduction is, harm reduction is a set of practical strategies, ideas, and principles aimed at reducing negative impacts associated with drug use. Harm reduction is also a movement for social justice built on a belief in and respect for the rights of people who use drugs, led by people who use drugs. And there's a really nice quote at the bottom of this, I hope you can all see. It says, harm reduction is a politic of self-determination, mutual aid, and unrelenting love and commitment to our people. Cassandra Frederick is an American drug policy advocate and a harm reduction activist. She is the president of the Drug Policy Alliance. This quote is from an international harm reduction conference.
Mm-hmm. And I really love Cassandra's quote because it brings in love. And I think that is a critical part of harm reduction, that we're bringing to people unrelenting love. Without boundaries, we're bringing love to people, and it's a critical part of this definition.
So we have some principles of harm reduction. So I'll read them, a few of them off to you. So principles of harm reduction is we approach drug use with neutrality, which means it accepts for better or worse that licit and illicit drug use is part of our world and chooses to work to minimize its harmful effects rather than simply ignore or condemn them. Number two is drug use is not a moral issue. People who use drugs are not bad people because they use. Services and resources have been provided to people who use drugs to be non-judgmental and non-coercive. Three is well-being over sobriety. The focus is the quality of the individual and community well-being, not necessarily the cessation of use. Number 4 is nothing about us without us, and I love this one. Harm reduction is about self-determination and is led and driven by people who use drugs. People who use drugs and those with lived experience of drug use should have a real voice in the creation and provision of programs and policies designed to serve them. And what we mean by nothing about us without us is that doesn't mean like we go to somebody's house or we go meet them for coffee. What it means is nothing about us is people get to make their own choices about their drug use. It's their choice. Their body is their body, and whatever they choose to do with their body is not for us to judge or stigmatize them. So we don't come with the mindset of trying to get people to go into detox or treatment because that's coming from a judgy place. And that's not what harm reduction is all about. The 5th one is we recognize the structural harms. So harm reduction acknowledges that the realities of poverty, class, racism, trauma, and sex-based discrimination and other social inequalities affect both people's vulnerability and their capacity for effectively dealing with drug-related harm. Number 6 is works to reduce stigma related to drug use. Stigma causes far more harm than drugs do. Open and honest conversations about the people's drug use can be life-saving. And in KMOPS, we often, in KMOPS, we hire people that have lived or living experience. And what we mean by that is they have either used drugs in the past or may still be using drugs. And the reason that we hire these people is because they come with such a great skill set. They understand what people are going through, and it helps to build very trusting and long-lasting relationships. So we have a lot of clients that will come into us, and if they are looking for a treatment program or a detox center, we are more than happy to sit down with them and make that phone call, spend time talking about what their goals and aspirations may be. So we find that it's very important to have these type of staff working with us because they get the whole harm reduction aspect of the work that we do. And we have found that it works very well within TNG. We also talk about holistic and balance. So harm reduction looks at the whole person, acknowledges that many factors contribute to decisions about drug use. So I'm sure many people didn't just wake up one day and say, well, I decided I want to become a substance user. Many factors come into that. It depends on many things. They may be struggling from homelessness. They may have lost friends and family in their life. All kinds of things can contribute to why people use drugs, but that's still not a reason to judge them or stigmatize them. So harm reduction considers the pros and cons and the risk-benefit analysis of those decisions.
Thanks, Tina.
I'm going to turn this over to Barb because this is the history part.
And before I get into that, is there any questions or comments about what we've covered so far?
There have been a few comments in the chat. There's some related to the nothing about us without us, as including acknowledging and respecting people's agencies, which I think you've also brought up, and also being mindful to include voices with lived experience in leadership, organization level conversations whenever and wherever possible, and creating of policies. We did have a question about addiction and misuse of prescription drugs, and I don't know if you wanted to take that up a little bit more later, but I'm just flagging it that was added to the chat.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I just want to identify that I don't identify as a person who uses drugs. I believe that I'm an ally. We've ensured that our KMOPS team, so the people working in our supervised consumption site, are all people with experience with drug use, primarily injection drug use experience. Some current, some former, but we really felt like that was an important qualification to be able to work in this position. But to the point that we also need folks in leadership positions as well. And we don't currently have that. I don't identify as a drug user. Although, of course, I do use drugs. And I think that's probably true of everybody here in this meeting. Someone's got their coffee. Yes, Aline, thank you. I had probably a little bit too much this morning because I was a little nervous. But yeah, you took an aspirin yesterday because you had a headache. You had a glass of wine with your dinner because it's Friday night. Woohoo! Or the smokers among us are using drugs, and in our society, some drugs are okay and other drugs are not okay. And what tends to happen is that the drugs that are not okay are the people that use the drugs that we think are not okay tend to get labeled addicts, regardless of what their drug use looks like. So we do know that people do struggle, that some people do struggle with their drug use. They're unable to regulate it at certain times in their lives. It becomes compulsive or kind of an overwhelming desire to use that drug of choice or the drug that they're using. But not always, right? Drug use changes for people, and we tend to view, when we use a word like addict, or if we view drug use through that lens, then it keeps us from seeing all of the nuance and all of the change that happens in people's lives. So we often see people who go through a period of time where we worry about their health because their drug use looks to us to be so chaotic. We don't always know why. The person who's using doesn't always know why. And anyone walking past who didn't know them would say that's an addict, or might say that. But we know, because we have long-term and trusting relationships with people, that that kind of behavior might only be for a limited period of time. And then whatever changes in their life, they are able to make some changes to their use so that it doesn't look so chaotic or it's not so harmful to their health. They might choose to stop using for a period of time, or for the rest of their life. They might choose to stop using one kind of drug and instead use another kind that is more manageable for them. And we often employ folks. We call them peer workers. We also employ people with lived experience of drug use in regular full-time union positions. But for many of our community members, they find employment with us at various times in their life when their drug use is manageable and they're able to manage it. And again, some people can do that for a long period of time. But if their drug that they're using is an illegal drug, then we tend to call them an addict. If their drug is coffee, if their drug is cigarettes, then we don't. And so we'll go over some language issues with harm reduction further along in our workshop, but language does become really important when we're doing harm reduction work and when we're talking to people who are using drugs, being aware of the language that has seeped in to our consciousness as a society about how we talk about drugs and how we view people who use drugs. It's actually very insidious. Yeah, so I got more things to talk about, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. But I hope that helps. Does that, the person who posted that, was that the start of this conversation at least? I can't
That
see
was
it.
originally Bob, but Janet has also posted that, I think echoing what you're saying about languages like, or terms like addiction, dependency, and being clean can be stigmatizing, and notes that different substances, their legality has shifted over time.
Definitely. Janet, that's a perfect segue. Thank you for that.
Into the
Now
history.
I get to do my storytelling. Oh, my slides are not moving. Oh, there we go. Okay. History of harm reduction. Okay, so drugs have been around forever, and there's a little, that's not our drawing in the middle, but different kinds of drugs throughout history have been used often in spiritual practices for many cultures around the world. We have noted, biologists have noticed that animals will get high, and we got a little kitty cat with the catnip there. But also they've found animals in the wild will find fruit trees that have dropped their fruit and the fruit is fermenting on the ground. And the animals will find those fruits and eat them because they want to get a little bit drunk. I don't know too if you've noticed little kids when they spin around in circles, they spin and spin and spin until they fall down. There's something in us that likes to alter our consciousness for different reasons. So whether that's a spiritual reason, whether it's just to have fun, just to see the world in a different way, we do have this innate desire to alter our consciousness. What has happened is, for various reasons, we have made that okay sometimes in some places and not okay in other times and places. This image at the bottom left came from, I think, a very old Christian monitor, actually, Fear Narcotic Drugs. And our war on drugs is actually fairly recent in human history. And I don't want to get too deep into the dates and acts and those kinds of things. There's some legislation that was passed, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that a lot of the drug laws that we're living with now are rooted in racism and colonialism. That we started looking to regulate people's drug use because of fears of racial mixing, as they used to call it, people of different races coming together to use drugs, and for other reasons. So, for example, the Opium Act came directly out of race riots in Vancouver. So, you know, we had many Chinese workers come to help build our railroad across the country and along the Pacific. And when those railroads are finished, many Chinese workers settled in BC and in Vancouver. They were regulated to Chinatown. They couldn't live anywhere else. They had very few options for opening businesses, running businesses. But one of the things that the Chinese brought with them was smoking opium. Now, opium was not new in Canadian culture and white settler culture. We used opium in a tincture of alcohol, and we called it laudanum. And it was medicine. And you could buy it kind of anywhere, like any druggist, any tobacconist, any corner store type place. You could often find laudanum and buy it over the counter. The same thing with cocaine. Cocaine is an analgesic, which means it's a topical pain suppressant, and it numbs. If you just put some powder cocaine on a piece of your skin, that part of your skin will become numb. So it was sold as teething powder. And mom or nanny would put cocaine on a baby's gums when they were teething so they'd stop crying. And then you just have to deal with kind of a bit of an active baby, but not screaming and crying anymore. So those drugs were okay, as long as people didn't get out of control. And that's a big issue for us thinking as a society, thinking about drug use. We don't want people to get out of control. We want them to stay acting like a productive, normal member of society. And when people start getting out of control, then we as a society start getting anxious about it, and we want to start regulating that. So the Opium Act, so anyway, there was this race riot in Vancouver in 1907. There was an economic slump. The Chinese, as always, were seen as taking jobs away from white settlers. And so there was a protest in downtown Vancouver, and a group of white men splintered off, went to Chinatown, wrecked the place, broke windows. And so the government sent an emissary to find out what was really going on. And when he was there, he was sort of buttonholed by these anti-opium activists who were actually also racists, and they were anti-Chinese activists, using opium as, you know, as sort of a tool, a way to move their agenda forward. And so in 1908, the Opium Act was enacted, and then we had a legal tool to use to discriminate against Chinese immigrants. Also, of course, many laws were passed to manage the Indigenous people in Canada, you know, often called the Indian problem. And I apologize if this is offensive to anyone. It should be. It's hard to hear. And as a white settler in this on this land, I think it's important for me to confront the things that were done in my name. in the past. So many, many laws were passed to try to manage Indigenous people, where they could live, how they could earn money. And one of the things was after having introduced alcohol to the Indigenous people here, then we started regulating how they could get it. In particular, how they could not get it. And it became an offense in 1888 to sell alcohol to Indigenous people, or for Indigenous people to have alcohol, which meant that their use was driven underground. They still used alcohol, but now they were using off-label, they were using whatever they could find. And lots of things contain alcohol, and so people end up drinking things that are not meant as a beverage. So this was early in the last century, and it went on through the 20s. We actually have a great social experiment that happened in the 1930s, primarily in the United States, but also in some provinces of Canada. We enacted prohibition of alcohol. And what we can see from that is exactly what we're seeing now, having prohibited some different drugs. So alcohol was made illegal, and what we saw was the rise of gangs. You know, that was the Al Capone era. We saw a rise in drug-related violence. We saw a rise in drug poisoning. So alcohol was made, still made, people still wanted it. It was made, you know, you hear about bathtub gin, but anyone could be selling anything that, you know, altered somebody's consciousness. So people were drinking formaldehyde, they were drinking rubbing alcohol, sold as whiskey or whatever else. And it caused a lot of problems, a lot of social problems, a lot of health problems. And so this social experiment of prohibition was finally discontinued and prohibition was repealed. Because what we learned from that experiment was that we cannot abolish our human desire to alter our consciousness. And then we forgot that lesson and we did it again. So what happened after prohibition was there was a bit of a shift, and we went from seeing drug use, including alcohol use, as a moral failing. People who were using drugs were often called degenerates, and they were criminalized, like they were only criminalized. They were criminal, degenerate drug users. What happened as the medical profession gained more power and authority in our society was our ideas shifted to what we're now calling the medical model. So now in the medical model, substance use is seen as a lifelong disease that can be cured with the right physician, with the right professional. That professional could help you get back to being a productive member of society. We saw the growth of the 12-step movement. And so in some ways, this is a small step forward because we're thinking of a person as sick, not necessarily their fault, instead of a criminal degenerate. But we're still taking agency and power away from an individual and assuming that what's happening for them is bad and that it's all about this one thing. So it's also taking away everything else that that person is, right? They're just the addict or alcoholic or whatever. They're not also a parent, a son or a daughter, you know, a librarian or a mayor. They're just an addict. And I love this quote by Maya Salovitz, another American drug policy advocate. And she says that a lot of people believe that hitting rock bottom is helpful to recovery, that treating people horribly helps them. We don't do that for any other condition. There's no other condition where we think disabling people is helpful. I think that's really powerful. I also want to say that I am not disparaging 12 steps. We see at TNG that abstinence, that choosing to not use drugs is part of a spectrum of harm reduction. If someone decides that they no longer want to use drugs, that's reducing their harm, and that's totally fine. And if they want to do 12 steps to make that happen for them, that's fantastic. The concern for me and for all of us is that the language of 12 steps has taken over our dialogue about drug use. So you think about how common it is, and even we see this all the time in sentencing from judges. if you have any kind of drug-related charges, you'll get sentenced to a 12-step program. You will be told that you need to hit rock bottom. You will be told that you need to give up your personal agency to a higher power. And this is all our understanding of how drug use gets treated as a medical condition. And people who have been through 12 steps, you know, they take that all on and they will tell you that I'm an addict, I'm a lifelong addict, I'm a dry drunk, I'm whatever else. And we're trying to, again, thinking about language and how much that creates stigma and how much that people have to take on in order to talk about their drug use in our society. Okay, so any ideas from folks? What changed I'm sort of blocking my own thing. What do you think changed to create our thinking about drug use and harm reduction as we know it now? Any ideas that people might have?
Maggie's got her hand up.
Okay, go ahead.
HIV/AIDS.
Yeah, that was a big one. Before the HIV epidemic, we also had the 60s. And I know there are some people here who were around in the 60s, right? Counterculture, Summer of Love. And what happened was people started to see that what they had been taught about drugs was wrong. It was a lie. They saw their friends smoking pot and were like, they're not turned into crazy sex maniacs. Their lives aren't going down to Skid Row. They're just like being all groovy and cool. So this is another lesson from history. We need to be honest when we're talking about drugs. We need to be honest, particularly with youth, because they're not dumb. And now they have like worldwide knowledge in their tiny phones, right? So we need to be upfront and clear with people about what drugs are really about, pros and cons. We also I hope I'm not talking too much. Okay, I'm going to try to do this a little bit faster. So we did see in 1972, and I think in reaction to what, you know, concerned parents that their kids were using pot, the government commissioned the Ledane Commission. So Senator Ledane headed up this commission, this inquiry into the non-medicinal use of drugs, and this was in 1972. And what they came up with was amazing. They said that drug possession and drug use should be a public health issue rather than a criminal issue. And this was huge. This was a big, big breakthrough because up until that time, every public response to drug use had been a criminal response. Even when we looked at the medical model, those drugs were still illegal and people using them still went to jail. So this was huge that a government commission came up with the idea that maybe this isn't the right path. Maybe we need to think about this in a different way. And then there was a change of government. And the liberal government was voted out and a conservative government came to power and the Ledane Commission report was shelved. At the same time in the United States, President Nixon declared a war on drugs, probably to help bolster his little adventure in Southeast Asia. So the war on drugs really helped the war in Vietnam and the illegal war in Laos because it meant that US soldiers now could go into these areas and just burn down the poppy fields and the crops, the opium crops that were being grown as a way to advance their war aims. So we lost this moment. We had this great opportunity and it was lost. And then the person who mentioned, then we hit the 1980s and the HIV epidemic. And what happened for people using drugs is they looked around and they saw that any talk that was happening about HIV was happening around gay men. And gay men were able to be upfront about what was happening in their communities. And people who use drugs who are also dying from AIDS, transmitted through sharing of syringes, were sort of left out of the discussion because their drug use was so stigmatized. even more so than men having sex with men. Drug use was that thing that you couldn't talk about. And so what happened was that people who use drugs, injection drug users in particular, had to start helping each other. They only had each other. And we saw the rise of drug user organizing and their term, junkie unions, buyers clubs, the self-organizing and mutual aid that came out of this real fear and justifiable fear of HIV in the drug using community. Okay, so currently, things have been shifting. So since the 1980s, and in response to the HIV epidemic, we implemented needle exchanges because we started thinking about this. This is now a public health issue. We can't just keep throwing these people in jail. They're dying. And there's still lots of fear and ignorance around HIV, but clearly what we're doing isn't working, and so we need to take a public health approach. So we started doing needle exchange. We started and then started gradually thinking about other ways. We started talking to people who use drugs, asking what people need, and in that way started growing our understanding of what we could do and what was necessary to do. And so now we're in a situation, and I have to say, 20 years ago, if you had told me that we would have supervised consumption anywhere in Canada, I would have laughed at you, like, not in my lifetime, no way. And the explosion of harm reduction programming, even in the last 10 years, has been incredible. We are now, have hit a bit of a roadblock, as somebody mentioned earlier. We'll be talking hopefully more about that later, to figure out what we can do about that as a community. So this is just, me and a colleague here, a little photo. We were doing some educating on the street, and we have stickers and posters that say, "I support harm reduction in my neighborhood." We've got lawn signs too, if people are interested. You can go to the Toronto OPS Instagram or Twitter account and find out more information. And I really love this quote again by Maya Zalovitz to say, "We are not passive participants of change. We are the architects of change. They didn't build prohibition in a day, so unfortunately, we can't take it down in a day either." I think that's the end of our history section. Yeah. So just before we move in, I'm going to turn it over to Tina. Are there any questions or comments about the history lesson? Here endeth the lesson.
Well, there's some comments about, the its parallels with the medicalization of queerness, and also the racial being, there's more tolerance sometimes for out of control white people, like, let's say, drunk, rowdy white college students, for instance,
Totally.
than other groups of people.
Yeah.
I think we do want to focus on the current situation and how community exists in and around sites. There is a question if anyone knows if there's a harm reduction site in Oshawa, and I can't recall.
There's not a safe consumption site, but there is a Durham Region Harm Reduction Coalition, and the John Howard Society in Oshawa offers a lot of harm reduction resources.
That's
Thanks, Maggie.
But not a current safe consumption site.
That's right.
Take it away, Tina.
Okay, so we're going to talk about harm reduction in practice. So it all comes back to our principles and our belief and respect for the rights of people who use drugs. So harm reduction is working with people on achieving their goals and not imposing ours. So if a client was to come into the OPS, we don't come with the mindset that this person is out of control with their drug use, they need a detox bed, or they need to go to treatment. That's not our decision to make. It's their body, their choice again, and we have to respect the choices that our individual clients make about their drug use. So substance use is a choice that most people engage in at some point in their life. Me, for instance, I'll tell you a little story about myself. I used drugs for a very long time. I started using drugs when I was a teenager, and I eventually ended up using heroin and injecting myself. It wasn't until I had made a conscious decision for myself that that wasn't the road that I wanted to be on anymore. So I did go to treatment, again, my choice, and it worked very well for me. I ended up going to college for 2 years after that and ended up working with TNG, which I'm very proud to call my home, and ended up being a supervisor. And I couldn't have done that, I don't think, at any other job site except TNG. And this is where our love for people who use drugs comes into effect, that we give people chances. Again, Barb had mentioned earlier that our staff in the OPS all have lived or living experience. So some of our staff used to use drugs. Some of our staff may still use drugs, but it takes those kind of people and that kind of experience to build the kind of relationships that we have with our clients. Our clients will often come in and we have questions of the week. So we ask clients, what does KMOPS mean to you? And I'm going to say about 75% of our clients call it their home. And that means a lot to us. That means that we're doing our job, that people know that when they come into our site, that they're not judged. They're not being stigmatized. We welcome them. We show them care and compassion, whether it means we're having a conversation about how the drug use looks today. Some people might come in and say, hey, I haven't used in a week and I don't want to use anymore. So I want to get into a program, or I want to start looking for a job. And the staff in the OPS, we help them with their choices, because again, they're their choices. But then a week later, that same client may come in and they're back using their substance of choice. But we don't say, oh my God, last week you were not using drugs and this week you are, what's going on? It opens up a conversation. So like many things can happen to change people's drug use. We often lose clients, which can be very hard on people. It's very hard on the staff. It's very hard on us at TNG, and I'm sure on all of you when we lose people. So there's many circumstances of why people use drugs and why they choose to continue their drug use, whether it's minimal drug use or they're very deep into their substance use. It doesn't matter what point they're at in their substance use. They know that they can always come to us and we will take the time to sit down with them and have a conversation. So substance use exists on a spectrum and is changeable for lots of people. Like I was just saying, some people may come and say, I haven't used for a week. I haven't used for a month. They may want to get a job. And then something happens where they didn't get into a program that they wanted to get into, or a job that they really wanted, they didn't get that job. So for them, it's dealing with the pain of rejection, of not getting employment or getting into a program, that very often what people are doing is they're trying to subside their pain. They're trying to push everything down. And I did it for many, many years in my own addiction. But we still have to give people those choices, and we just have to support them wherever they are, which again is why we meet people where they're at. And we always do that at TNG. So continuing to use substances in the face of negative effects may still be a rational choice and make sense to medicate extreme pain, distress, destabilization that many people face. People end up homeless. They lose their homes. They end up living in encampments and in tents. So circumstances are different for everybody that chooses to use substances. But the most important thing is just to support people where they're at, and continue to support them and respect their choices, no matter what that choice is. It's not for us to decide what somebody should do with their body. It's their choice again, and we have to respect that choice.
Can I just jump in with one thing,
Sure.
Tina?
Mm-hmm.
Because just adding to what you're saying, I think when we stress that and we do that, there's no judgment to what people are doing. That is about their drug use. But I want to be clear that that doesn't mean that harm reduction is a free for all. It doesn't mean we're just like, oh, come in here and do anything you want. Like you can kick our staff member, like there are still boundaries. And I think when we take harm reduction into the community, it doesn't mean that you have to be okay with everything. If you have somebody who is camped out in your garage, using drugs in your garage, and that's not okay with you, maybe you're concerned that they're going to leave things behind or they're going to burn your garage down. It's okay to have boundaries, and it's okay to say, we want to support you in however we can, but this is what we can help you with. If you want to, if you want to hurt somebody else, we're not going to support you in doing that. We're going to support you in your stuff as much as we can. But when your stuff starts infringing on other people, then we're going to have some conversations about what that looks like. So I do want to be clear about that, because I know sometimes our focus is on supporting people, and so we sound like we're just like, yeah, do whatever you want. But there are boundaries always. And I think when we take it to the community, there will be boundaries there as well.
Yep.
Next
Thanks,
slide,
Barb.
Tina.
Sure.
Cool.
Okay, so this is where we get into the language. So sometimes you may hear people who use drugs refer to themselves as junkies or crackheads or addicts. I don't correct those people. The staff doesn't correct those people. If they choose to call themselves that, then we have to respect that that's how they're looking at themselves. But we are all very, very conscious of the language that we use. So if somebody is using opioids, we don't call them a junkie. We call them a person who uses opioids. If somebody calls himself a crackhead, again, we don't correct them. They are a person who uses crack, is the way that we look at it. Because these words are steeped in judgment and stigma, and it's often used to dehumanize people. And it's their right to reclaim them. Using drugs doesn't define a person, just as playing a sport or career doesn't define you. Saying someone is clean implies that someone that uses drugs is dirty, and it reinforces stigma again. And we try not to do that. So there's also things that reflect in the medical field. Often doctors, if people that are using methadone clinics or on Suboxone, when they do a urine sample, we say negative or positive test results. We don't say dirty or clean, because again, saying dirty refers that the person is dirty or their drug use is dirty, and we try to stay away from that stuff. We also say we don't say somebody's unmotivated or non-compliant. We say that a person is experiencing barriers to accessing services, and we come across that a lot. We have folks come in all the time that are looking for a detox bed. And when we call, the answer seems to be no all the time lately. Trying to get somebody a detox bed lately has been a nightmare for us, because the answer is always no. And then that client gets fed up with hearing the word no and feels that nobody's there to help them or support them. So we do agree that we do need more treatment centers. We do need more detox beds, and that's not our problem. It's our problem, but other people need to step in to help this happen. So language is really, really important. So we try to use practical language when we're talking to people. We don't judge them, no matter what word they want to use for the day. It's their choice to use it. Again, these are slurs, and we do recommend that people don't use them. It has a very negative impact on people. So we try to use positive reinforcement, and especially with the words and the language that we use. We're going to talk about, does anybody have any questions? No?
I don't see anything coming up in the chat.
I don't see anything either. Go ahead, and I'm
Okay.
sure there'll be some questions towards the end.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
Is this me, Tina, or is this you?
Yeah, this is you. We're going to talk about harm reduction in practice.
Yeah. Okay. So, Tina and I work in an agency that is providing harm reduction programs and services to people. That's not the case for everybody. And so, but it is our firm belief that anyone can do harm reduction work, regardless of where they are and where they're working out of. Or not working, just being. So we talk about here in this slide some practical ways to be doing harm reduction in your community, wherever that is. And the main one is really, so PWOD is people who use drugs. It's just an acronym there. So engaging with people who use drugs using non-judgmental language. So our stress on language comes up again. Being mindful of the language that you're using when you're engaging with folks, and taking the time to engage, to say, hey, how you doing? What do you need? If anything, can I get you a cup of coffee? How are you? Making sure there are posters around. So, and I'm kind of looking at folks that are in a space, I don't know, your church hall or your parish office, to have posters or signs that are indicating that you support folks who use drugs, that they are welcomed in your space, that there's not going to be judgment for them in your space. You may want to think about supplying safer use kits. So these are the kits that contain unused supplies so that people don't share. We want to make sure lots of kits get out. But it's important to know what's in them. So if you choose to have some kits on you, or naloxone kits on you, make sure you know what's in them and how to use them. Naloxone kits, obviously, you want to know how to use it. And that's something that you could go to your public health department. We do trainings in the community at TNG, but wherever you are, there's very likely someone available that could teach you how to do naloxone. It's not hard. When I say train, it's like 15 minutes to actually get it down. There's nasal Narcan. That's this little machine down here, which is really just a spray. You stick up someone's nose and spray it in. Easy to do. You can inject naloxone as well, like similar to an EpiPen, although you do have to draw it up into the syringe. And you can't hurt somebody by giving them naloxone. So even if you come across someone and they're not overdosing, maybe they've passed out from heat stroke or something, if you give them naloxone thinking they're overdosing, you're not going to hurt them. It has no negative effect. It only reverses an overdose. So those are some things. If you're wanting to become more knowledgeable and able to do that, that's doing harm reduction in your community. And knowing what's in the kits, if you're going to distribute them, is really important. It's one of the things we do when we have new staff come to the agency, even if they're not doing distribution of harm reduction kits, we make sure that all the staff know what's in the kits, and know the lingo that's used in the street for those pieces, those materials that people use to use drugs, because it indicates to folks that you know something about what's going on for them, that you've taken the time to learn some of their language. So people will come in, we have pipes that we distribute for smoking crystal meth. So it gets called a TINA pipe, a meth pipe, a bowl pipe, and anything that they ask, we want our staff to be able to say, I know what you mean, and I'm going to get you the kit, and I know what's in the kit. It's not just the pipe, there's alcohol swabs, there's other pieces, and I'm the staff person, I know what's in there. So if you do choose to do that, make sure you know what's in the kits and what they're for, what the pieces are for. Naloxone, sharps containers in the washroom. Any diabetics that are using your space will appreciate it as well. People doing fertility treatments use syringes, as well as people using other kinds of drugs. Having a sharps container or a biohazard waste bin in your washroom spaces can be really helpful. And helping people create overdose prevention plans. So if you're engaging with someone, having a chat, and they reveal to you that they use drugs, having a chat with them, like, what's your plan? Where are you going to stay tonight? Where are you going to use tonight? Are you going to be with someone? Is someone going to be there with you in case you go down? Do you have the app? There's an app now that is being shared around. Not everyone has a phone, but for people who have phones, you make a call and say, I'm going to use by myself. Can you give me a call back? And if I don't answer, then the person on the other end of the phone will initiate a 911 call for you. And I kind of want to open it up now. I'm going to expand my viewing of everybody and open it up what other ideas? I know we have some real expertise in this audience today, and I want to hear from you. What else are you doing in your community to practice harm reduction with love? You can put it in the chat or just unmute yourself.
Somebody noted that you can go to the pharmacy and ask for a naloxone kit, and they will walk you through it and show you how to
Yes.
use it,
Yeah,
Yeah, they
great
will.
suggestion.
which is something that anybody on this call could do.
Yeah. Any other ideas that people are using in their communities?
I guess I have a question and a comment. I've been told that naloxone can be quite dramatic and jarring for people, and that you shouldn't just give it out willy-nilly. That it really should be that. Where someone is truly gone into overdose. So I guess I've spent a lot of time just sitting with people who they haven't reached that state, just sitting with them, watching to make sure that they're okay, they're still breathing, they're everything's fine with them. And I guess I've gotten a lot more comfortable just sitting and waiting it out with them. But wondering about, do I have the correct impression about that, or can you speak to more the impact of naloxone on people and making that decision as to whether to administer it or not?
Yeah. Thanks, Megan. You're not wrong. It can, naloxone takes the place of opiates on your opiate receptors. So what that means for the person who's using is that when they get a big enough dose of naloxone, it means all of their opiate receptors are now occupied. So all of a sudden they are in withdrawal. If they've been a regular user, it can put them into withdrawal very quickly. And they wake up very grumpy, feeling very unwell. So there are a few things that I would say to that. That can happen, but they're not dead, right? They haven't overdosed and died. So you have saved a life, and even if they're grumpy with you and swear at you and tell you that everything was fine and you did that for nothing, you know that you've saved their life. But you do want to have a further conversation to say you really were overdosing, and the half-life of the naloxone is shorter than the half-life of the opiate that you've taken, very likely. And so if I don't stay with you, or if you don't get around other people, you could go back into an overdose, even though you feel really crappy now. So don't use again. You still have opiates in your system. Then if the naloxone goes away and the opiates are still in your system, you could overdose again. So, please hang tight. I know you feel like crap right now, but don't use again. That's really the major downside of using naloxone is that. One of the things that we do, and again, our staff have lots of training, is they tend to use the injection naloxone more than the nasal, and they're able to titrate the dose, which means that if you have a syringe full of naloxone, you can inject just some of it. You can inject a third of it or half of it to see what the effect is. And if the person comes out, that's great. If they stay in still, you're seeing blue lips, you see that they're not breathing or not breathing well, then you can give the rest of the dose. But again, that's what our staff do that do this on a really regular basis. For most folks on the street, you're just gonna come across someone, you're probably gonna panic a little bit. You don't know how long they've been down. You're just gonna give them whatever you can as fast as you can and deal with the consequences afterwards. And you will know that you have saved their life. However cross they are with you, you know that you saved their life. Maggie, you have a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to note that I think for people who are not doing this all the time and not working in an OPS, the trickiest thing about naloxone training is recognizing an overdose.
Yeah.
And I think at first, as Megan said, at first you want to, like, the first sign that somebody's even drowsy, you want to give them naloxone.
Yeah.
Um,
Don't do that.
but yeah, I mean, it would take a little longer discussion about this, but I think Megan's pretty much got it. If somebody's still breathing regularly, you know, they may be deep out, but if they're breathing regularly, they don't need naloxone.
Yeah. And what we're seeing now, because we have, and this is another language thing, we don't have an overdose crisis. We have a poison drug supply.
Yep.
And what we're seeing a lot from the folks that we're interacting with that are using our services is that a lot of what people are using is cut with benzodiazepines, which is a sedative. And so people go down and we're like, oh dear, this looks like an overdose, but we check and we're like, no, their oxygen is great. They're breathing slowly, but they're breathing, they're getting oxygen in, but we cannot rouse them. They are, for all intents and purposes, dead to the world. They're not. We keep an eye on them, but you can't rouse them. So it makes them super vulnerable, right? If they're not in our space, if they're out in a park and they are unrousable, people are losing all of their possessions. They're being robbed. They're being sexually assaulted, and they have no memory of what happened because they were absolutely out of it. So this is one of the language things that we really need to address because it has real life impacts on people. This is a poison drug supply. This is not an overdose crisis.
There was a really good question in the chat from Angie. Angie, I don't know if you wanted to ask it directly or do you want me to ask it?
Go, Angie.
You there, Angie? Anyway, I'll ask it.
Okay.
Angie asks, as you're building community safety and bonds, which is so critical, how can people who find an OPS as a place of home and inclusion continue to feel at home there if they choose to not use anymore? Do you find people come to a place of choosing to leave the OPS community for what they would consider their own well-being, i.e. if they find themselves triggered to hang around often, like would they be triggered to use when they chose not to do that? As an advocate for OPS, she says, I find this question comes up with people I speak with, and I'd love to hear your opinion and would love to know if you have various options for community engagement within your OPS community, perhaps different roles they can play depending on if they're in different places in their journey.
Yeah, that is a really great question. And I would say that I think we're really lucky at KMOPS because we're located in a larger community health center. So we have a drop-in center, we have case management, we have advocacy groups. We call it our member advocacy group. There are lots of ways that people can be involved. And as someone started in our OPS, in our overdose prevention site, and then they choose not to use, sometimes we stop seeing them. They choose to remove themselves from the community because it is triggering, or yeah, they just figure like they'll get drawn back into it. We also know though that people who choose to stop using for a while will often complain about being lonely, that they've left their community. Because everyone they know is using, and that's who they hang out with. And so part of the work is to make sure that we're still connecting with people to say, what else? What else can you do? What else can we provide? If you love art, we have an art group in the drop-in. If you want to volunteer, here's a bunch of places you can volunteer. It might be with us, might not be. You might want to go to a place that's an abstinence-based place so you won't run into folks who are using or who might be using or you knew when you were using. So yeah, we don't just drop people when they stop using. Sometimes they drop us, but we would never drop someone. We stay connected and we try to make sure that they get their new needs met wherever they can.
Barb, can I just step in for a sec?
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to add, we've had a number of our clients that have used our OPS that have gone on to join our peer programs and have been very successful in those placements. I have some of those folks actually work on the outreach team. So peer programs are very, very important to us at TNG. I think we have about 200 peers, Barb, or so. So
yeah, something like that.
yeah, so we let people know if this is the decision they made, that here are some other options for you. And the peer program seems to be very, very well responded to.
If I could just note, as someone who works near the OPS, one of the things that's always struck me about how well it integrates aspects of community is people will go to the OPS even if they're not using at that moment, even if they're not worried about an overdose, because they need to be in a chill space.
Yep.
And I think that's a real testament to the sort of community that exists around the OPS and around TNG generally. But I will, you know, when there were conflicts in the encampment, often somebody would take somebody else aside and say, listen, why don't you just go to the OPS and chill for a bit?
Yeah.
Come and hang out with us.
Yeah.
We have a really cool chill space.
It is. It is.
Yeah, comfy chairs. Maggie, you also made me think, and this is a bit of a tangent, but we haven't talked a lot about the community of people who aren't using. And I think that's really important too. In harm reduction, the definition of harm reduction for us includes a wider community that includes people who don't use. So we take steps to make sure that we're addressing the needs of the wider community. And I think currently our current problem is that a lot of problems, a lot of issues are getting conflated. And certainly this current provincial government is doing their best to muddy the waters and conflate them. But the fact that there are people who are unhoused and living in tents in parks is not a result of supervised consumption sites. And it's not a problem that supervised consumption sites are designed to resolve. And so some of the people that use our service do live in an encampment. Many of them don't. And many of the people who live in encampments are not using drugs at all. And so when we conflate these two things, then it becomes very easy to point fingers at this harm reduction program without acknowledging that we do a lot for the wider community. So the team goes out every morning to do needle sweeps in the community. They'll walk around the block. They'll pick up every syringe they see in the alleyway, in somebody's yard. You know, they don't go on private property, but you know, if it's open, if it's visible, they will do that work to keep the wider community safe. They engage with folks in the encampments. We also have an outreach team, a peer outreach team, so people from the community, some current drug users, some former drug users that engage with folks in the encampment to say, if you are using, come and use our OPS, don't use in the park. And if you are going to use in the park, don't leave your syringes. Do you need a sharps container so you can clean up after yourself? And how do you feel like you're part of this community and therefore need to take responsibility for this community as well? So I think by keeping people who are regularly marginalized in our community, people who are poor, living in desperate poverty and use drugs, we are saying to them, you are part of this community. And that comes with benefits and it comes with responsibilities. And so come and use our space, come into our programs, and we are going to help you with whatever. And if that means, if engaging with community means that you got to deal with your anger or mental health issues or, you know, and whatever we would kind of label antisocial behavior, we're going to help you with that. We are going to demonstrate love and what loving community looks like, with the idea that that's going to sink in for you and you're going to want to be part of community, and therefore you're going to want to be responsible in this wider community. Maggie.
Yeah, I wonder if I wanted to make a different comment. I'm sorry, there is crashing going on in my house. I'm going to need to find out what it is, but I really want to make this point.
Okay.
People have been asking what else they can do, how else they can help. I feel reasonably sure that everybody on this Zoom call knows people who do not use street drugs. And probably a lot of those people have really incorrect ideas about the use of street drugs, illicit drugs. So one of the things that everybody on this call can do is talk to people. Talk to people who maybe they may find it really frightening to see somebody using in public. They may be confused about what all this is about. They may think that safe consumption sites are a place where somebody just goes in and you say, oh, hey, here's your drugs, go on over there. Because that's the picture that Ford has presented.
Yes.
So something that everybody on this call, on this Zoom can do is talk to people you know. And if they say wrong or misleading or confused things about street drugs or people who use street drugs, talk to them about it. Talk to them about this interesting workshop that you went to. Talk to them about someone you know who uses illicit drugs, who is your friend. Whatever experience you have that you can draw on to help undermine that stigma and undermine those stereotypes. That's really available to everybody here.
Yeah, and smashing stereotypes is so important because they're really prevalent. Thank you, Maggie, for that. I think that's really important, and it's a great takeaway because you're right, we can all do that anytime. So that does lead us, we got just about 5 minutes left, I think. The future of harm reduction, what's next? A few things there. I did want to just mention what's not there. We do talk about decriminalization. There's a strong movement afoot that's really pushing the federal government, that would come from the feds, to decriminalize. So it would just take away criminal penalties for different things, and it depends on who you're talking to. Some people are like, just decriminalize use. Some people are saying decriminalize small possession of small amounts for, you know, selling for yourself. I think there isn't really anyone who's talking about decriminalizing large scale drug trafficking, but I think what I would like to see is actually legalization and regulation. And this goes back to the conversation, or my history lesson around prohibition, because we have learned, we really have learned that making these drugs illegal has not worked. The war on drugs has not worked. It's a failed policy. And so if you can get past any kind of fear around legalization, and the thing that comes up the most when I talk about this with people is they'll say, oh my gosh, but that just means everyone will be using drugs. And I say to them always, would you? And the answer is usually like, well, no, not me. I'm not going to start using heroin, or I'm not going to start using cocaine, not me, other people. Like, well, will they really though? And think about it instead the way that the LCBO works. So we had a situation during Prohibition where this drug, alcohol, was illegal. It was unregulated, and people died of alcohol poisoning or whatever it was they were drinking. We have that situation now. What if we had a drugstore the way that we have a liquor store? It's regulated. You need ID. You need to be a certain age. You know exactly what you're buying, because when you buy a bottle of wine, the percentage of alcohol is right there on the bottle. That's necessary. That's required to be able to sell this bottle of wine. It has to have the percentage of the drug on the label. What if we did that with everything, and you knew exactly what you were getting, so that you wouldn't overdose? It's medical grade. It's not cut with all kinds of other poisonous things. You know what you're getting, and it's legal and regulated, and it's taxed. Your tax dollars then go into funding treatment centers, because we do know that there are people who struggle with whatever kind of drug use it is. It could be, you know, and people struggle with lots of different things. We hear about sex addiction and shopping addiction and
Gambling.
What's that? Gambling addiction. We do, you know, sometimes there are some folks who just engage in some kind of compulsive behavior, and we do need supports for that. 100%. And so the tax dollars from our new drugstore goes to treatment for the folks that do struggle with compulsive drug use. But for the rest of us, we can just choose what it is that we want to use to alter our consciousness, which we all want to do at different times. This is my dream. This is my idea. This is not a TNG sanctioned plan. We're not going ahead with this at the Neighbourhood Group. But I do think it's worth thinking about. And I think it shifts our understanding of drug use in our society. So I'm going to leave it there. There's some things on the slide that I think you guys can all read. I have mentioned as well that building community is so important. And to Maggie's point, this is something we can all do. So this is a number of members of our staff at the Neighbourhood Group protesting, and Jessica Bell there got in our picture. She's our member of parliament member of provincial parliament for our neighborhood. We went to Queen's Park to make our voices heard and make sure that the voices of people who are using drugs get centered in this fight, this political fight currently, but going forward with all of our programming, all of our policy decisions, that the voices of people who are using is front and center. Tina, did you want to add anything?
I don't think so. I just like to thank everybody for taking time out of your very busy lives to be here today and for showing your interest in the work that we do. This is where our hearts are at, and this is why we do this work. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. And I hope you learned something new today.